The blood-soaked sunset painted Utica, Montana territory, in fiery hues as Grace Lawson clutched her father's arm, trying to ignore the whispers that followed them down the dusty main street. At 22, she had grown accustomed to the stares, but not the words, never the words that questioned her virtue simply because she had no mother and lived alone with her father in their modest cabin on the outskirts of town. "Pay them no mind, Gracie," Thomas Lawson murmured, his weathered face crinkling with a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach his tired eyes. At 53, he had raised Grace alone since her mother died of fever when Grace was just 7. His once strong shoulders now stooped from years of backbreaking work in the silver mines, but his pride in his daughter never diminished. "I try not to, Pa," Grace replied, adjusting the simple bonnet that covered her auburn hair. "But sometimes I wonder if we wouldn't be better off somewhere else." Thomas sighed. "This is our home, child. Has been since before you were born. A man doesn't run from gossip." They continued their Saturday journey into town for supplies, the Montana summer of 1878 proving particularly unforgiving. Grace's cotton dress clung uncomfortably to her back as they approached Caldwell's general store. The bell above the door jangled as they entered, and Mrs. Caldwell's pinched face softened slightly at the sight of them. "Afternoon, Thomas." "Grace," she nodded, her eyes quickly darting away. Even after all these years, the townspeople maintained a peculiar distance respectful of Thomas's hard work, but wary of a man raising a daughter alone. "We'll need some flour and coffee, if you please," Thomas said, placing a small leather pouch on the counter. "And whatever's left can go for sugar." Grace wandered to the fabric section, running her fingers along a bolt of blue calico she could never afford. The sound of spurs jingling against wooden floorboards announced another customer, and she turned to see James Young, the new deputy sheriff, standing in the doorway. At 28, James cut an imposing figure in the small store. Tall and broad-shouldered, with sandy hair and eyes the color of the Montana sky, he'd arrived in Utica just 3 months ago from somewhere back east. Rumors said he'd fled some kind of trouble, but in the West, most men carried shadows in their past. "Miss Lawson," he nodded politely, removing his hat. Unlike many of the men in town, James had never leered at her or whispered behind her back. "Deputy Young," Grace acknowledged, lowering her gaze as heat rose to her cheeks. Thomas watched the exchange with narrowed eyes. "We'd best be getting on, Gracie. Got those fence posts to mend before sundown." Outside, the street had grown busier as Saturday brought the ranchers and miners into town. Thomas and Grace moved through the crowd, gathering the last of their supplies when a commotion erupted from the Silver Dollar Saloon. The batwing doors burst open, and a group of rowdy cowboys stumbled out, led by Ezra Blackwell, the foreman from the Circle B Ranch. "Well, if it ain't Thomas Lawson and his precious daughter," Ezra called out, his words slurring. "Tell me, Thomas, how much you charging for an hour of her company these days?" Grace froze, her face draining of color as several bystanders chuckled nervously. Thomas's hand tightened on his parcel, his knuckles turning white. "You've had too much to drink, Blackwell," Thomas said evenly. "Go sleep it off." Ezra staggered forward, the stench of whiskey preceding him. "Don't be so selfish, Thomas. Girl that pretty shouldn't be wasted on just her pa unless—" His mouth twisted into an ugly sneer. "The rumors are true about what goes on in that cabin of yours." The silence that fell over the street was deafening. Grace felt her stomach turn as she realized what Ezra was insinuating. Several women hurried their children away, while the men watched with uncomfortable fascination. "Take it back," Thomas said, his voice dangerously quiet as he set down his packages. "Take it back now, Ezra." Ezra laughed, turning to his companions. "Looks like I touched a nerve, boys." What happened next occurred so quickly that Grace barely had time to register it. Thomas, Her gentle father, who had never raised a hand in anger that she could recall, lunged forward with surprising speed and drove his fist into Ezra's jaw. The larger, younger man staggered backward but didn't fall. "You'll regret that, old man," Ezra growled, drawing himself up to his full height. The fight was brutal and swift. Thomas landed another solid blow, but Ezra's youth and size quickly turned the tide. Within moments, Thomas was on the ground, blood streaming from his nose and mouth as Ezra kicked him repeatedly in the ribs. "Stop it!" Grace screamed, rushing forward only to be held back by one of Ezra's friends. "You're killing him." Through her tears, Grace saw a blur of movement as Deputy Young pushed through the crowd. He grabbed Ezra by the collar and yanked him away from Thomas's crumpled form. "That's enough, Blackwell," James commanded, his hand resting meaningfully on his holster. "Back off now, or you'll spend the night in a cell." "He attacked me first," Ezra spat, wiping blood from his split lip. "After you insulted his daughter," James replied coldly. "Now clear out before I decide this town would be better off without you for a spell." Ezra glared but retreated, his friends following reluctantly. James knelt beside Thomas, carefully helping the older man to sit up. "Can you stand, Mr. Lawson?" Thomas nodded grimly, his face a mask of pain. "Just need a minute." "Pa!" Grace sobbed, finally breaking free and rushing to her father's side. "Oh, Pa, your face. Doc Miller's office is just down the street," James said, supporting Thomas's weight as the older man struggled to his feet. "Let me help you there." Together, they made their way to the doctor's small office, ignoring the stares of the townspeople. Dr. Miller, a kind-faced man in his 60s, ushered them inside without question. "Fighting at your age, Thomas?" he chided gently, examining the wounds. 3 broken ribs, possibly 4. Split lip. Might have a cracked cheekbone. "He was defending me," Grace whispered, her voice breaking. "Ezra Blackwell said terrible things." Dr. Miller's expression darkened. "That man's tongue is more dangerous than any 6-shooter. He turned to Thomas. "You'll need to rest for at least 2 weeks. No mining, no heavy lifting." Thomas groaned, not from pain but from worry. "Can't afford 2 weeks without pay, document." "I'll work," Grace said immediately. "Mrs. Henderson at the hotel has been looking for help with laundry." "You will not," Thomas began, then winced as the effort of speaking sent pain through his ribs. "Your daughter's right, Mr. Lawson," James said from the doorway where he'd been standing quietly. "You need to heal properly. And if you're worried about your claim, I can ride out a couple times a week to check on it." Grace looked up at the deputy with surprise and gratitude. "That's very kind of you, Deputy Young." "James, please," he corrected gently. "And it's no trouble. It's my job to look after the people of Utica." As Dr. Miller wrapped Thomas's ribs, James excused himself, promising to return the next day to help get Thomas home. When he left, Grace found herself staring after him, a strange flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the day's trauma. "Gracie," Thomas said weakly, drawing her attention back. "I'm sorry." She took his hand, careful to avoid the bruised knuckles. "For what, Pa? For standing up for me? Don't ever be sorry for that. For not giving you a better life. Proper mother. For all the gossip you've had to endure." Grace shook her head firmly. "You've given me everything a daughter could want. Pa, love, security, respect. What happened today isn't your fault." But as they sat in the quiet of the doctor's office, Grace couldn't help but wonder how today's events would change their already precarious place in Utica's society and what role the kind-eyed deputy might play in the days to come. True to his word, James arrived at the doctor's office early the next morning with a wagon borrowed from the livery. Dr. Miller had insisted Thomas stay overnight for observation, concerned about internal bleeding. Grace had remained by her father's side, dozing fitfully in a hard wooden chair. "How is he?" James asked quietly, finding Grace alone in the waiting area while the doctor changed Thomas's bandages. "Better than he might have been," she replied, smoothing her rumpled skirt self-consciously. "Dr. Miller says the bleeding has stopped." James nodded, his eyes taking in her exhausted appearance. "Have you eaten anything?" She shook her head. "I didn't want to leave him." Without another word, James disappeared, returning 20 minutes later with a basket containing fresh bread, cheese, and 2 apples. "Mrs. Peterson at the boarding house sends her regards," he explained, setting the food before her. The simple kindness nearly undid her. "Thank you," Grace managed, her voice thick with emotion. "Eat," he encouraged, taking a seat across from her. "You need your strength." As Grace broke off a piece of bread, she studied James covertly. In the clear morning light, she could see faint lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of hardship, despite his relative youth. "May I ask you something, Deputy?" she ventured after a moment. "James," he reminded her with a small smile. "And yes, why are you helping us? You barely know my father or me." James was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes thoughtful. "I know what it's like to be judged by gossip rather than character," he finally said. "When I first came to this territory, people had a lot to say about a man who'd leave Boston to become a lawman in Montana. And what brought you here?" she asked, genuinely curious. A shadow crossed his face. "A need for a fresh start. My father was a judge back east. He had my life planned out: law school, a respectable practice, marriage to a society woman. When I chose a different path, it didn't sit well. So you came as far west as you could." "Something like that," he agreed with a rueful smile. "But I've never regretted it. There's an honesty to life out here that I appreciate. When a man shows you who he is, for better or worse, you can believe it." The doctor's door opened before Grace could respond, and Thomas appeared, leaning heavily on Dr. Miller's arm. His face was a patchwork of purple and yellow bruises, but his eyes were clear. "Ready to go home, Gracie?" he asked, his voice raspy but determined. James stood. "I've brought a wagon, Mr. Lawson. Figured it would be easier than trying to get you on a horse." The journey back to the Lawson cabin was slow and painful. Every bump in the rutted road caused Thomas to wince, though he tried to hide it from Grace. James handled the team with expert care, choosing the smoothest path possible. Their cabin came into view just as noon approached, a modest structure of rough-hewn logs with a small vegetable garden to one side and a chicken coop to the other. A thin wisp of smoke still rose from the chimney, evidence of the fire Grace had banked before they'd left for town the previous morning. "It's not much," Thomas said apologetically as James helped him from the wagon. "It's a fine home," James replied without hesitation, and Grace felt a surge of gratitude for his tact. Inside, Grace quickly set about making her father comfortable in his bed while James brought in their packages from town, which someone had thoughtfully retrieved and placed in the wagon. When that was done, he hesitated at the door. "Is there anything else you need before I head back to town?" Grace thought of the unfinished chores: water to be hauled, firewood to be chopped, animals to be fed. Ordinarily, she and her father shared these tasks. Now, with Thomas bedridden, they would all fall to her. "We'll manage," she said, unwilling to impose further on his kindness. James glanced around the cabin, clearly noting the empty water bucket and dwindling woodpile. Without a word, he removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves. "I've got a few hours before I need to be back on duty," he said simply. "Show me where you keep the axe." For the next 3 hours, James chopped enough firewood to last a week, repaired the chicken coop door that had been hanging crooked for months, and hauled bucket after bucket of water from the creek to fill their barrels. Grace watched him work from the doorway, a strange warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the summer heat. When he finally prepared to leave, the sun was beginning its westward descent. "I'll come by tomorrow to check on you both," he promised, settling his hat back on his head. "Why are you really doing all this?" Thomas asked from his bed, his voice stronger after rest and food. James met the older man's gaze directly. "Because it's the right thing to do, and because what happened in town yesterday wasn't right. This community should be looking after its own, not tearing them down with vicious gossip." "Well, we're grateful," Thomas said gruffly. "Aren't we, Gracie?" "Very grateful," she agreed softly, her eyes meeting James's. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. Then James nodded once and was gone, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance. "Decent young man, that deputy," Thomas observed, watching his daughter's face carefully. "Yes," Grace agreed, busying herself with the cooking pot to hide the blush she could feel rising to her cheeks. "Yes, he is." The next 2 weeks fell into a pattern. Each morning, James would ride out to the Lawson cabin before his shift began, bringing news from town and often small gifts, a jar of honey from Mrs. Peterson, a book of poetry that Grace had admired in the general store window, fresh vegetables from someone's garden. He never mentioned who in town had sent these things, and Grace suspected many came from his own pocket. Pride nearly made her refuse them, but the genuine pleasure he seemed to take in bringing them made rejection impossible. While Thomas recuperated, growing stronger each day but still unable to work, Grace took the laundry position at the hotel. The work was hard, hauling heavy wet linens, standing over steaming tubs for hours, her hands red and chapped from lye soap, but the pay was steady. Each evening, she would return home exhausted but satisfied that she was contributing. James often appeared at the hotel around the time she finished, offering to walk her home despite it being well out of his way. These walks, as summer began its slow surrender to autumn, became the highlight of Grace's days. "Tell me about Boston," she asked one evening as they followed the path along the creek, the setting sun turning the water to liquid gold. "I've never been farther east than Helena." James chuckled. "It's nothing like Montana. The buildings crowd together so tightly that in some neighborhoods, you can reach out your window and touch the house next door. And the noise, carriages, streetcars, vendors calling their wares at all hours. It sounds exciting," Grace mused. "It can be," he agreed. "There are theaters and museums, libraries with more books than you could read in a lifetime." He glanced sideways at her. "But there's a beauty here that Boston could never match." The way he looked at her as he said it made Grace's heart skip. She turned her face away, unable to meet his intense gaze. "What about you?" James asked after a moment. "Have you always lived in Utica?" Grace nodded. "Born and raised. My mother died when I was 7, influenza. Pa never remarried, though I think Mrs. Caldwell at the store had hopes at one time." "And you've never thought of leaving?" The question gave her pause. "Sometimes," she admitted, "especially when the gossip gets particularly cruel. But this is Pa's home. His claim is here and my mother's grave. I couldn't leave him." "You're very loyal," James observed quietly. "He's all I have," she replied simply. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, until James cleared his throat nervously. "Grace, I was wondering if you might. That is, would you consider?" He stopped, seeming uncharacteristically flustered. "There's a social at the church next Saturday evening. Would you allow me to escort you?" The invitation stunned her. Church socials were respectable gatherings, attended by all the proper families in town. No one had ever invited her before. "I don't think that would be wise," she said softly, regret coloring her words. "People would talk." "People already talk," James pointed out. At least this way, they'd be talking about something real, rather than their own cruel imaginings. Is that why you're asking me? To give them something real to gossip about. James stopped walking, turning to face her fully. I'm asking because I enjoy your company more than anyone else's in this town. Because you're kind and strong and far more educated than you let on. Yes. I've noticed the books in your cabin and how well read you are. I'm asking because when I finish my rounds each day, the thought of seeing you is what keeps me going. Grace's breath caught in her throat. James, you don't need to answer now, he said quickly. Just think about it. When they reached the cabin, Thomas was sitting outside on a rough-hewn bench, enjoying the evening air. His bruises had faded to yellow shadows, and he moved with only slight stiffness. Evening, deputy, he called, raising a hand in greeting. Staying for supper? James had joined them for meals several times over the past weeks, and Grace found herself hoping he would accept. Not tonight, sir. I've got to finish my rounds. He tipped his hat to them both. I'll stop by tomorrow. As he rode away, Thomas gave his daughter a knowing look. That young man's sweet on you, Gracie. She busied herself with the door latch. He's just being neighborly, Pa. Thomas snorted. Neighborly doesn't make a man ride 4 miles out of his way every day, nor bring gifts fit for courting. He invited me to the church social, she admitted, unable to keep the wonder from her voice. Thomas's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Then his face split into a wide grin. Well, now that's a step in the right direction. When is it? Next Saturday. But Pa, I can't go. You know what people will say. Let them say what they will, Thomas replied firmly. You deserve some happiness, child. And James Young is a good man, the kind who stands up for what's right, even when it's not easy. The next morning, Grace was hanging laundry behind the hotel when she overheard Mrs. Henderson, the hotel owner, speaking with Harriet Wilcox, the banker's wife. Did you hear? Mrs. Wilcox was saying in a hushed tone that nonetheless carried clearly in the still morning air. Deputy Young has invited the Lawson girl to the church social. No, Mrs. Henderson exclaimed. Surely he knows better than to associate with her kind. Apparently not. My Henry says the deputy's been riding out to their cabin every day since the incident with Ezra Blackwell. Well, Mrs. Henderson sniffed. I suppose we shouldn't be surprised. Men will be men, and she's pretty enough if you can overlook her. Reputation. What reputation might that be, ladies? James's voice cut through the air like a whip, causing both women to jump guiltily. Grace froze behind the sheet she was hanging, her heart pounding. Deputy Young, Mrs. Wilcox stammered. We were just spreading malicious gossip about a hard-working young woman who's never done anything to deserve your contempt. James finished for her, his voice cold. I expected better from the leading ladies of this community. Now see here, Mrs. Henderson began, drawing herself up indignantly. No, you see here, James interrupted. Grace Lawson is a lady of impeccable character who has endured more hardship and shown more dignity than anyone I've met in this town. Her father is a good man who's worked honestly for everything he has. If I hear one more word against either of them, I'll be having a talk with Reverend Phillips about Christian charity and bearing false witness. The women stared at him, mouths agape. From her hiding place, Grace pressed a trembling hand to her lips, tears welling in her eyes. Good day, ladies, James concluded curtly, turning on his heel only to find himself face to face with Grace. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Then Grace dropped the laundry basket and fled, running blindly through the back alleys of Utica until she reached the small footbridge over the creek at the edge of town. There, hidden by a stand of cottonwoods, she finally stopped, her chest heaving with exertion and emotion. Grace, James called, his footsteps pounding on the wooden bridge as he caught up to her. Grace, wait. She turned to face him, unable to hide the tears streaming down her face. You shouldn't have done that. Defended you? I'd do it again in a heartbeat. You don't understand, she insisted. Things were just starting to quiet down after what happened with Pa and Ezra. Now you've made it worse. James took a step closer, his expression earnest. The only way to stop gossip is to confront it head-on, to show them they're wrong about you. But what if they're not wrong about me? The words escaped before she could stop them. James froze. What do you mean? Grace turned away, staring down at the creek. I'm not what you think I am, James. Then tell me who you are, he said quietly, coming to stand beside her at the railing. Because I think you're the most remarkable woman I've ever met. The compassion in his voice nearly broke her. When I was 16, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. A man came through town, Joshua Mercer. He was handsome and charming, with tales of San Francisco and New Orleans. I was young and foolish, and he paid attention to me when no one else did. James remained silent, letting her continue at her own pace. He said he loved me, that he wanted to marry me and take me away from Utica. For 3 weeks I believed him. I met him in secret by the old mill. She closed her eyes, the shame of it still raw after all these years. I gave him everything a woman can give a man. The silence between them stretched, broken only by the gentle burble of the creek. And then, James finally prompted. And then he left, in the night without a word, took what he wanted and moved on. She forced herself to look at James, needing to see his reaction. The whole town knew. They'd seen us together, despite our attempts at secrecy. For months, they watched me, waiting for my belly to swell with his child. But it didn't, James guessed. No. By some miracle, no. But the damage was done. I was ruined in their eyes. Loose, they called me. Fast. Pa nearly killed himself working double shifts at the mine to save enough for us to start fresh somewhere else. But then the accident happened. Accident? A cave-in 3 years ago. Crushed his leg. Dr. Miller saved it, but he walks with that limp now and can't work like he used to. The money for starting over went to medical bills instead. She wiped at her tears with the back of her hand. So you see, they're not entirely wrong about me. I made a terrible mistake. James was quiet for so long that Grace became certain he was figuring out how to politely excuse himself from her company forever. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. A mistake at 16 doesn't define a lifetime, Grace. We've all done things we regret. She looked up at him, hardly daring to hope. Even you. A shadow crossed his face. Yes, even me. He hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. I didn't leave Boston just to escape my father's expectations. I left because I killed a man. Grace gasped. What? It was justified, he added quickly. He attacked a woman, my sister's friend. I intervened, and in the struggle. He shook his head. The law cleared me, but the man's family was influential. There were threats. My father thought it best if I disappeared for a while. So you understand, Grace said softly, what it's like to be judged. I do. James reached out slowly, as if afraid she might bolt, and took her hand in his. Which is why I'm still asking, will you come to the social with me on Saturday? Grace looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his earnest face. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will. The news that Deputy Young would be escorting Grace Lawson to the church social spread through Utica like wildfire. By Saturday morning, it was all anyone could talk about. Thomas, now well enough to move about freely, watched with amusement as Grace fretted over her appearance. You look beautiful, Gracie, he assured her as she pinned up her hair for the 3rd time. That blue dress brings out your eyes. The dress in question was her best 3 years old but carefully preserved, with only a slight fade at the hemline to betray its age. She'd spent the previous evening adding fresh lace at the collar and cuffs, a touch of elegance that had cost her a week's wages but felt worth every penny. "Are you sure you'll be all right alone?" she asked for the dozenth time. "I could stay home. And disappoint that young man? Not on your life," Thomas replied firmly. "Besides, I've invited Roy Parker over for cards. We'll be just fine." A knock at the door sent Grace's heart racing. She smoothed her skirts once more, took a deep breath, and opened the door to find James standing on their porch, looking more handsome than she'd ever seen him. Gone was the dusty deputy's uniform, replaced by a crisp white shirt, black string tie, and a suit that looked newly pressed. "Miss Lawson," he said formally, removing his hat. "You look absolutely stunning." "Thank you," she managed, her cheeks warming at the open admiration in his gaze. "You look very handsome yourself." Thomas appeared behind her. "Have her back at a decent hour, deputy," he said with mock sternness. "And mind you treat her like the lady she is." "Yes, sir," James replied solemnly. "You have my word." The church hall was already buzzing with activity when they arrived. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the simple decorations of autumn flowers and dried corn husks. A small group of local musicians played in one corner while children darted between the adults, their laughter adding to the festive atmosphere. The moment Grace entered on James's arm, a hush fell over the room. She felt dozens of eyes turn in their direction, heard the whispers begin almost immediately. Her steps faltered. "Chin up," James murmured, placing his hand reassuringly over hers where it rested on his arm. "Remember, you have as much right to be here as anyone." Reverend Phillips approached them first, his wife at his side. "Deputy Young, Miss Lawson," he greeted them warmly. "How wonderful to see you both. Thomas not joining us this evening. He's still recuperating, Reverend," Grace explained, grateful for the kind welcome. "But he's much improved. Please tell him he's in our prayers," Mrs. Phillips added. "And Grace, dear, we could use some help with the refreshment table if you wouldn't mind." Martha Simmons was supposed to assist, but her baby came early this morning. "I'd be happy to help," Grace replied, surprised and touched by the request. James escorted her to the refreshment table, where she was soon busy pouring punch and arranging cookies on platters. To her astonishment, several of the younger women engaged her in conversation, asking after her father and complimenting her dress. It was as if James's public declaration of her worth had granted her a reprieve from years of ostracism. When the dancing began, James appeared at her side. "May I have this dance, Miss Lawson?" She hesitated, eyeing the dance floor where couples were forming for a Virginia reel. "I'm not sure I remember the steps. It's been a long time since I've danced." "Then we'll learn together," he said, leading her to the floor. The music swelled, and Grace found herself swept into the pattern of the dance. James was surprisingly graceful for such a tall man, guiding her through the turns and promenades with confident hands. When they came together in the middle of the formation, his smile was so genuine, so full of delight, that Grace couldn't help but respond in kind. By the third dance, she had forgotten to worry about what others might think. By the fifth, she was laughing freely as James twirled her around the floor. And by the last dance of the evening, a slow waltz, she was keenly aware of his hand at her waist, the slight pressure of his fingers, the way his eyes never left her face. "Thank you," she said softly as they moved in perfect rhythm, "for convincing me to come, for everything." "Grace," he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle for words. "I want you to know that whatever he might have said was interrupted by the church doors bursting open. Ezra Blackwell stood in the doorway, clearly intoxicated, his hand resting menacingly on the revolver at his hip. "Well, ain't this a pretty sight?" he slurred, his gaze fixing on Grace and James, the high and mighty deputy and the town whore, dancing like they belonged together. The music screeched to a halt. James stepped in front of Grace protectively, his hand moving to his own weapon. "You're drunk, Blackwell," he said evenly. "Go home before you do something you'll regret." Ezra sneered. "Defending her honor again? Seems to be a habit around here. First her pa, now you. Makes a man wonder what she's offering in return." Several of the men in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, but no one moved to intervene. The memory of what had happened to Thomas Lawson was still fresh in everyone's mind. "That's enough," James warned, his voice taking on an edge Grace hadn't heard before. "I'm not going to tell you again." "Or what?" Ezra challenged, his hand tightening on his gun. "You'll shoot me? In front of all these fine, God-fearing folks? For insulting a woman who's no better than she ought to be." "For disturbing the peace," James corrected calmly. "For public intoxication. For threatening an officer of the law. Take your pick." Grace could feel the tension in the room rising to a dangerous pitch. Ezra was drunk enough to be reckless, and James would be duty-bound to respond to any threat. Either way, the evening would end in violence. "Ezra Blackwell," she called suddenly, stepping out from behind James despite his attempt to keep her shielded. "I feel sorry for you." Ezra blinked, clearly not expecting this response. "What did you say?" "I said I feel sorry for you," Grace repeated, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "You're so empty inside that you have to tear others down to feel anything at all. What a sad, lonely existence that must be." A murmur ran through the crowd, Ezra's face contorted with rage. "You don't know nothing about me, girl." "I know enough," she replied. "I know that a real man doesn't need to demean women to prove his strength. I know that true courage isn't found in a bottle or at the end of a gun." For a moment, it seemed as though her words might cut through his drunken haze. Then Ezra's hand moved to draw his weapon. Before he could clear the holster, James was in motion. In one fluid movement, he crossed the space between them and struck Ezra's hand away from the gun. The revolver clattered to the floor as James delivered a solid punch to Ezra's jaw, sending the larger man staggering backward. Unlike Thomas, James had youth, training, and sobriety on his side. Ezra barely managed to land a single blow before finding himself face down on the church floor, James's knee in his back as the deputy efficiently handcuffed him. "Somebody fetch the sheriff," James ordered, his breathing only slightly elevated despite the exertion. "Mr. Blackwell will be spending the night in jail." Two men hurried to comply while the rest of the crowd broke into excited chatter. Grace stood frozen, overwhelmed by the rapid turn of events. Sheriff Turner arrived quickly, helping James haul the now subdued Ezra to his feet. "Sorry about this, folks," the sheriff addressed the gathering. "Please continue your evening. Deputy Young will return shortly to escort Miss Lawson home." As they dragged Ezra away, the man twisted to glare at Grace over his shoulder. "This ain't over," he growled. "Not by a long shot." The social limped to a conclusion after that, the festive mood irrevocably broken. Grace waited anxiously, wondering if James would indeed return or if he'd be occupied with official business for the remainder of the night. Mrs. Phillips approached her as she helped clean up the refreshment table. "My dear, would you like my husband to escort you home? It's getting late, and after what happened." "Thank you, but I'll wait a bit longer," Grace replied, touched by the concern. "If Deputy Young can't return, I'll accept your kind offer." She needn't have worried. Just as the last of the decorations were being taken down, James appeared in the doorway, looking weary but relieved to see her still there. "I wasn't sure you'd wait." he said as they walked to where his horse was tethered. Of course I waited, she replied. Is everything all right at the jail? James helped her onto the horse before mounting behind her, his arms encircling her waist as he took up the reins. Ezra's sleeping it off in a cell. Sheriff Turner has agreed to keep him locked up until tomorrow afternoon at least. The ride home was quiet, both of them processing the events of the evening. Grace was acutely aware of James's solid presence behind her, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way his arms tightened slightly around her when the horse navigated a particularly uneven stretch of road. When they reached the cabin, a single lamp still burned in the window. Thomas waiting up for his daughter's return. James helped Grace dismount, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. I'm sorry the evening ended as it did, he said softly. I had hoped. It was wonderful, she assured him, looking up into his troubled face. Until the interruption, it was the most wonderful night I can remember. The moonlight cast silver shadows across his features as he searched her expression. Grace, may I call on you properly? With your father's permission. Her heart soared at the formal request. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I would like that very much. He smiled then, a smile that transformed his entire face and made him look younger, less burdened. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he bent his head toward hers. Their lips met in a kiss so gentle, so sweet, that Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. When they parted, James touched her cheek with tender reverence. Good night, Grace Lawson, he murmured. Dream of better days to come. She watched him ride away, her fingertips pressed to lips that still tingled from his kiss. Better days to come. For the first time in years, Grace allowed herself to hope that such days might indeed be possible. Inside, Thomas was dozing in his chair by the fire, a book open on his lap. He startled awake at the sound of the door closing. Gracie? That you, girl? Yes, Pa, she replied, moving to bank the fire for the night. How was the social? He asked, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Did you have a nice time with the deputy? Grace couldn't contain her smile. James has asked to court me properly, Pa. With your permission. Thomas's eyebrows shot up. Then his weathered face broke into a broad grin. Well now, that's fine news indeed. More than fine. He studied her glowing face. You're sweet on him too, aren't you? I think I might be, she admitted, a blush heating her cheeks. Then he has my blessing, Thomas declared. Though I'll still need to have a man-to-man talk with him, make sure his intentions are honorable. They are, Pa, Grace assured him, remembering the gentle pressure of James's lips on hers. I'm certain they are. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the first hint of autumn's approach coloring the distant mountains. Grace hummed as she prepared breakfast, her mind replaying the events of the previous evening, the dancing, the easy conversation with the townspeople, the feel of James's arms around her. Thomas watched her with knowing eyes. You're fairly glowing this morning, daughter. She smiled, setting a plate of eggs and bacon before him. I'm just happy, Pa. For the first time in a long time. A sudden pounding on their door interrupted the peaceful scene. Grace exchanged a worried glance with her father before moving to answer it. Sheriff Turner stood on their porch, his expression grim. Miss Lawson, is your father at home? I'm here, William, Thomas called, rising from the table with a slight wince. What's happened? The sheriff removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. There's been trouble, Thomas. Ezra Blackwell broke out of jail last night, knocked my deputy unconscious and took off. James? Grace gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Is he? Deputy Young is fine, miss, Sheriff Turner assured her quickly. He wasn't on duty last night. It was young Peters manning the jail. Relief flooded through her. followed immediately by a new wave of concern. But why come tell us? Surely Ezra's halfway to the territory line by now. The sheriff's gaze slid away from hers. Before he left, he was heard making threats. Specific threats. Against you and your father. Thomas moved to stand beside his daughter. What kind of threats? The kind a man doesn't repeat in front of a lady, Sheriff Turner replied grimly. But serious enough that I've got men out looking for him, and I've stationed Deputy Peters here to keep watch on your place. Only then did Grace notice the young deputy standing a respectful distance behind the sheriff, looking sheepish about his role in Ezra's escape. "Where's James?" she asked, unable to keep the worry from her voice. "Leading the search party," Sheriff Turner explained. "He was most insistent. Said he wouldn't rest until Blackwell was back behind bars." "And in the meantime?" Thomas asked, his arm going protectively around Grace's shoulders. "In the meantime, I suggest you both stay close to home. Keep your doors locked and your rifle loaded." The sheriff settled his hat back on his head. "I'll send word as soon as we have news." As the sheriff departed, Deputy Peters took up position on their porch, his young face a mask of determination to make up for his earlier failure. The day stretched endlessly. Grace tried to occupy herself with household tasks, but every sound from outside sent her heart racing. Thomas cleaned his old Henry rifle and kept it within arm's reach, his expression darkening each time he glanced at the clock. By nightfall, there was still no word. Deputy Peters was relieved by another young man whose name Grace didn't catch. Thomas insisted she take his bed while he kept watch in the main room, but sleep eluded her entirely. Dawn broke with a gunshot. Grace bolted upright, her heart hammering against her ribs as Thomas shouted from the other room. She scrambled into her dress and rushed out to find her father at the window, rifle in hand. "Stay back, Gracie," he ordered, his voice tight with tension. "What happened? Where's the deputy who was watching the house?" Before Thomas could answer, the door burst open. Ezra Blackwell stood in the doorway, his face twisted with rage and liquor, a smoking revolver in his hand. "Your guardian's taking a little nap," he sneered, gesturing vaguely toward where the young deputy presumably lay injured or worse. "Now it's time to settle accounts." Thomas raised his rifle. "Get out of my house, Blackwell." Ezra laughed, an ugly sound devoid of humor. "Or what, old man? You'll shoot me? We both know how that turned out last time." "This time I've got a rifle, not just my fists," Thomas replied steadily, though Grace could see his arms trembling slightly from the effort of holding the heavy weapon. "And I won't hesitate to use it if you take one more step." Ezra's gaze shifted to Grace, something malevolent glittering in his bloodshot eyes. "Your fancy deputy ain't here to protect you now, is he? Sent him on a wild goose chase up into the hills. By the time he figures out he's been had, it'll be too late." "What do you want, Ezra?" Grace asked, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "What do I want?" he repeated, advancing another step into the cabin. "I want respect. I want people in this town to understand that Ezra Blackwell ain't to be crossed or made a fool of." "So this is about your pride," Thomas said with unexpected contempt. "A real man would have accepted his punishment like a man, not broken jail and come threatening a woman." Ezra's face darkened with fury. "You shut your mouth, old man. You think you're so high and mighty, you and that whore daughter of yours." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Thomas's finger tightened on the trigger just as Ezra raised his pistol. 2 shots rang out simultaneously, the reports so close together they sounded like a single explosion. Thomas staggered backward, blood blossoming on his shoulder. Ezra remained standing for a moment, a look of surprise on his face, before crumpling to the floor, Thomas's bullet having found its mark in his chest. "Pa!" Grace screamed, rushing to her father's side as he slumped against the wall. "I'm all right, Gracie," he gasped, his free hand pressing against the wound. "Just winged me. Check on him." Reluctantly, Grace turned to where Ezra lay motionless. The front of his shirt was soaked with blood, his eyes open but unseeing. Even from a distance, she could tell he was beyond help. "He's dead, Pa," she whispered, backing away from the body. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. "God forgive me," he murmured, "but I couldn't let him hurt you." The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Grace to the window. Relief surged through her as she recognized James leading a group of riders toward the cabin. "It's James," she told her father. "Help is coming." What followed was chaos. James burst into the cabin, his face pale with fear as he took in the scene. Thomas wounded, Ezra dead on the floor, Grace standing between them with blood on her dress that wasn't her own. "Grace," he breathed, crossing to her in 2 long strides and pulling her into his arms. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head against his chest, finally allowing the tears to come. "Pa's been shot." His shoulder. James released her gently, moving to examine Thomas's wound. "It's clean through," he reported after a careful inspection. "Bleeding's already slowing. You'll be all right, sir, though Dr. Miller will want to see you." Outside, the injured deputy was being tended to, knocked unconscious but otherwise unharmed. Sheriff Turner entered, surveying the scene with a grim expression. "Self-defense clear as day," he declared after hearing Thomas's account. "Blackwell broke jail, assaulted an officer, and came here armed and threatening. You had every right to protect yourself and your daughter." The body was removed, wrapped in a blanket and tied across a horse for transport back to town. Dr. Miller arrived to treat Thomas, confirming James's assessment that the wound, while painful, was not life-threatening. Through it all, James remained by Grace's side, a steady presence that anchored her in the midst of turmoil. When the cabin was finally cleared of everyone except Thomas, now resting comfortably thanks to the doctor's laudanum, James led Grace outside to the porch. "I should have been here," he said, self-recrimination heavy in his voice. "If I hadn't been fooled into searching the North Ridge." "You couldn't have known?" Grace interrupted, placing her hand on his arm. "No one could have predicted he would come here so quickly." James covered her hand with his own. "When I realized it was a false trail, when I thought of you here unprotected." He closed his eyes briefly. "I've never been so frightened in my life." "I wasn't unprotected," she reminded him gently. "Pa was here. He saved my life." "Yes, he did," James acknowledged, his expression softening. "He's a remarkable man, like father, like daughter." Grace smiled tiredly. "What happens now?" "Now," James said, drawing her closer. "Now we begin to build that better future I promised you. If you still want that." She looked up at him, this man who had defended her honor, who had seen her past and accepted it without judgment, who looked at her with such tenderness that it made her heart ache. "I do want that," she whispered, "more than anything." His kiss was different this time, still gentle, but with an underlying urgency that spoke of fear conquered, of gratitude for life preserved, of promises yet to be fulfilled. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Grace Lawson," he said simply. "I think I have since that first day, when you stood so proudly beside your father despite everything." The words she had never expected to hear, spoken with such sincerity, brought fresh tears to her eyes. "And I love you, James Young, more than I thought possible." In the weeks that followed, the story of what happened at the Lawson cabin became the talk of Utica. But unlike the cruel gossip of before, these accounts spoke of Thomas Lawson's courage in defending his daughter, of Grace's dignity in the face of danger, of Deputy Young's relentless pursuit of justice. Slowly, perceptibly, the town's attitude began to shift. Women who had once crossed the street to avoid Grace now stopped to chat when they met at the general store. Men tipped their hats respectfully when she passed. And when James formally announced his intention to marry Grace, the news was met with genuine congratulations rather than snide remarks. Thomas, his arm still in a sling but healing well, beamed with pride as James officially asked for his blessing. "You've more than earned it, son," he said, extending his good hand to shake James's. "You stood by my Gracie when few others would. There's no man I'd rather call my son-in-law." The wedding was set for Christmas Day, a time of new beginnings. Grace, with her newly improved status in town, found herself overwhelmed with offers of assistance. Mrs. Phillips insisted on hosting the reception in the church hall. Mrs. Henderson contributed linens for the bride's trousseau. Even Mrs. Wilcox, chastened perhaps by James's rebuke, offered the loan of a family heirloom, a pearl necklace for Grace to wear on her wedding day. 2 weeks before the wedding, James approached Grace after Sunday services, a mysterious smile playing about his lips. "I have something to show you," he said, helping her into the buggy he'd borrowed for the occasion. "A surprise." He drove to the east end of town, where a small creek meandered through a stand of cottonwoods. There, nestled among the trees, stood a neat cabin newly built, with a fresh coat of whitewash gleaming in the winter sun. "James," Grace breathed, taking in the smoke curling from the chimney, the curtains visible through spotless windows, the small barn at the rear. "What is this?" "Our home," he replied, watching her face anxiously. "If you like it." Tears blurred her vision as she climbed down from the buggy, drawn irresistibly toward the little house. James followed, explaining as they walked. "Sheriff Turner is retiring in the spring. He's recommended me for the position. It would mean more regular hours, better pay. I thought we could start our life together here and maybe someday when there are children." He trailed off as Grace turned to him, her eyes shining with joy. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Absolutely perfect." Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable, a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, 2 bedrooms. Someone had placed a vase of winter greenery on the table, and a cheerful fire crackled in the hearth. "Your father helped," James admitted as Grace explored their new home. "Said he wanted to make sure his daughter had a proper place to start her married life. Most of the furniture was his doing." Grace ran her hand along a beautifully crafted pine dresser, recognizing her father's workmanship. Despite his injured shoulder, he had somehow managed to create this gift for them. "And what about Pa?" she asked, the one worry that still shadowed her happiness. "I can't leave him alone in that cabin, especially now that he's injured." James's smile broadened. "That's the other part of the surprise. Turn around." She did as instructed, looking out the window to where James was pointing. Through the trees, she could just make out another cabin, smaller, but equally new. "For your father," James explained. "Close enough to visit every day, but far enough to give us privacy. Sheriff Turner's wife has already arranged for him to take over as the school's handyman once his shoulder heals. Light work, but steady pay." Grace threw her arms around James, overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness. "You've thought of everything." He held her close, his breath warm against her hair. "I want to give you the life you deserve, Grace. You and your father both." Christmas Day dawned clear and cold, the mountains surrounding Utica etched against a sky of perfect blue. In the small room behind the church where she prepared for her wedding, Grace smoothed the skirts of her dress, ivory satin trimmed with lace that she had saved for months to purchase. Mrs. Phillips fussed with the veil, arranging it carefully over Grace's upswept hair. "You look absolutely beautiful, my dear." "Truly stunning," agreed Mrs. Henderson, who had appointed herself assistant to the bride. A knock at the door revealed Thomas, resplendent in a new suit, his face freshly shaved and his eyes suspiciously bright. "Is my girl ready?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. The women discreetly withdrew, leaving father and daughter alone. "Oh, Pa," Grace breathed, taking in her father's transformation. "You look so handsome." "And you," he said, blinking rapidly. "You look just like your mother on our wedding day. She would be so proud of you, Gracie." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. "I've been saving this for you." It was hers. Inside the pouch was a simple gold band with a tiny pearl set in the center. "Her wedding ring," Grace whispered, recognizing it from her childhood memories. Thomas nodded. "She made me promise to give it to you when you found a man worthy of you. James is that man." Grace slipped the ring onto her right hand, vowing to treasure it always. "I love you, Pa. Thank you for everything, for raising me alone, for defending me, for loving me even when it wasn't easy. Loving you has always been the easiest thing in the world, daughter," Thomas replied, offering his arm. "Now, shall we make you Mrs. James Young?" The church was filled to capacity, not just with the usual congregation, but with miners, cowboys, and townspeople who had come to witness this union that symbolized something important to them all: the power of love and courage to overcome prejudice and past mistakes. James waited at the altar, tall and solemn in his best suit, his deputy's badge polished to a high shine on his lapel. When Grace appeared on her father's arm, his face transformed with such joy that a collective sigh rippled through the assembly. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Phillips began, his voice carrying to the rafters, "we are gathered here in the sight of God and this company to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The ceremony was brief but meaningful. When James slipped the gold band onto Grace's finger, his hands were steady, his voice clear as he repeated his vows. When Grace promised to love and honor him all the days of her life, she meant every word with all her heart. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the Reverend concluded. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. You may kiss your bride." James lifted her veil with tender hands, his eyes never leaving hers as he bent to claim her lips in a kiss that sealed their union. The church erupted in applause and cheers, led by Thomas, who looked as though he might burst with pride. The reception that followed was the most joyous gathering Utica had seen in years. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by every household. Music and laughter filled the church hall as townsfolk who had once shunned Grace now lined up to congratulate the newlyweds. Late in the evening, as the celebration continued around them, James drew Grace outside for a moment of quiet. Snow had begun to fall, dusting the world in silver. "Happy, Mrs. Young?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. "More than I ever dreamed possible," she replied truthfully. He brushed a snowflake from her cheek. "I promised you better days, remember? This is just the beginning." As they stood there in the gentle snowfall, their future stretching before them bright with promise, Grace thought of all that had brought them to this moment: her father's unwavering love, James's steadfast belief in her worth, her own journey from shame to redemption. "I love you, James Young," she whispered, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "Now and always." His response was to draw her closer, his kiss a silent vow that whatever life might bring, they would face it together. Spring came early to Utica in 1879, bringing with it new beginnings. Sheriff Turner retired as promised, and James was sworn in as his replacement. Thomas, his shoulder fully healed, took up his position at the school, where the children quickly grew to adore the kind-eyed man who told the best stories during lunch breaks. And Grace, now known throughout town as Mrs. Sheriff Young, found herself with child, a blessing that brought tears to James's eyes when she shared the news. "A family of our own," he marveled, placing his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "I never thought I could be this happy." The baby arrived in late October, a boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's auburn hair. They named him Thomas James Young, in honor of both his father and the grandfather who had sacrificed so much for his family. As Grace cradled her son in the home James had built for them, Thomas sitting proudly nearby and James watching them both with undisguised adoration, she thought about the journey that had brought them here. From a girl defined by gossip and one youthful mistake to a woman surrounded by love and respect, her path had not been easy. But every step, every trial had led to this moment of perfect contentment. "What are you thinking about?" James asked, coming to sit beside her on the sofa, his arms slipping naturally around her shoulders. "About how a father's love changed everything," she replied, smiling up at him. "How Pa defended my honor that day in town, and how that one act of courage ultimately led me to you." Thomas cleared his throat, clearly moved by her words. "Just did what any father would do," he said gruffly. "A man can't stand by and hear his child maligned." "Not every father would have stood up like you did, Pa," Grace countered gently. "You taught me what real strength looks like, what real love looks like." James pressed a kiss to her temple. "And now we'll teach little Thomas the same," he promised, "so that someday, when he has a family of his own, he'll understand what truly matters." As if recognizing he was being discussed, the baby opened his eyes, his tiny hand reaching up to grasp his mother's finger. 3 generations of love connected in that single touch, past, present, and future linked in an unbreakable chain. Outside, the sun set over the mountains, painting Utica in the same fiery hues as on that fateful day when Thomas Lawson had defended his daughter's honor. But now, instead of whispers and judgment, Grace's world was filled with voices of love and respect. She had honored her father with her heart by becoming the woman he always believed she could be. And in return, life had honored her with a love story that would be told in Utica for generations to come, the story of a brave father, a steadfast lawman, and the woman whose courage and dignity won the hearts of them both. "I love you both so much," Grace whispered, her gaze moving from her father to her husband, then down to the miracle nestled in her arms. "More than words can say." And as the first stars appeared in the Montana sky, she knew with absolute certainty that this moment, this family, this love was everything she had ever needed, and everything she would ever want. The years passed in Utica like the changing seasons, each one bringing new joys and challenges to the young family. Little Thomas grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his father's quiet strength and his mother's gentle spirit. When he was 3, a sister joined the family, Elizabeth Grace, named for James's mother and her own. 2 years later came William, completing their family circle. James served as sheriff with distinction, earning a reputation for fairness and integrity that spread throughout Montana territory. Grace, between raising their children, became involved in community affairs, eventually helping to establish Utica's first proper school building, where she occasionally taught when the regular teacher was indisposed. Thomas Lawson, grandpa to the young children, remained a beloved fixture in their lives. Though he maintained his own small cabin, he took most of his meals with the family and was present for every milestone: first steps, first words, first days of school. The children adored him, especially little Thomas, who followed his grandfather everywhere, learning to whittle, to fish, to tell stories that made people smile. On a golden afternoon in the autumn of 1889, as Grace stood at her kitchen window watching her father teach 10-year-old Thomas how to split kindling, James came up behind her, slipping his arms around her waist. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Young," he murmured, resting his chin on her shoulder. She leaned back against his solid warmth. "I was just thinking about how far we've come. 10 years ago today, we moved into this house. Best decision I ever made," James replied, turning her gently to face him. "Other than asking you to marry me, of course." At 33, Grace was more beautiful than ever, the passing years having added character to her features rather than diminished her. James, now the respected Sheriff Young with touches of silver at his temples, looked at her with the same adoration as on their wedding day. "Are you still happy, James?" she asked, a habit she had never quite broken despite his consistent answer. He smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Every day with you is a gift, Grace. Every single day." Outside, Thomas's laugh mingled with his grandson's as the boy successfully split a log. The sound drifted through the open window, a reminder of the legacy of love that had shaped their family. That evening, as they celebrated their anniversary with a special dinner, 7-year-old Elizabeth asked the question that had become a family tradition. "Tell us again how you met, Mama and Papa." James exchanged a glance with Grace, a silent question passing between them. How much of the story was appropriate for young ears? "Well," Grace began carefully, "your grandfather was in some trouble in town one day, and your father came to help. Because some bad men were being mean to Grandpa and Mama," Thomas supplied importantly, having heard versions of the tale throughout his young life. "That's right," James confirmed, ruffling his son's hair. "And I thought your mother was the bravest, most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. And Papa fought the bad men," 5-year-old William added with relish, clearly enjoying his favorite part of the story. Thomas Lawson chuckled. "That he did, young William. Your father was quite the hero." "But the real hero was your grandfather," Grace corrected gently. "He defended my honor when no one else would. He taught me what it means to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost." Thomas waved away her praise, but his eyes were suspiciously bright. "Just did what any father worth his salt would do." James raised his glass in a toast. "To Thomas Lawson, the finest father-in-law a man could ask for. And to Grace, who honored him with her heart and has blessed me with hers every day since." As the family clinked glasses cider for the children, wine for the adults, Grace felt a wave of gratitude, so intense it brought tears to her eyes. From the ashes of scandal and isolation had risen this beautiful life, this precious family, this enduring love. Later that night, with the children asleep and Thomas retired to his cabin, Grace and James sat on the porch swing, wrapped in a quilt against the autumn chill. Above them, stars scattered across the Montana sky like diamonds on velvet. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" Grace asked, her head resting on James's shoulder. "If Pa hadn't stood up to Ezra that day, if you hadn't come to our aid." "Sometimes," James admitted. "But then I look at our children, at the life we've built, and I can only believe that we were always meant to find each other. That every step, even the painful ones, was leading us here." Grace smiled, remembering the frightened young woman she had once been, so certain that happiness was beyond her reach. "I never dreamed I could have this," she confessed. "A husband who loves me, beautiful children, respect in the community. There were days I thought the gossip would follow me forever. And now," James prompted, "now I know that love is stronger than rumor, than mistake, than fear." She turned her face up to his. "You and Pa taught me that." James bent to kiss her, his lips warm and familiar against hers. When they parted, he kept her close, their breath mingling in the cool night air. "I've been thinking," he said after a comfortable silence. "Maybe it's time for a change." Grace pulled back slightly to see his face. "What kind of change?" "The governor has offered me a position in Helena Territorial Marshal. It would mean moving, but the children would have access to better schools, and there would be more opportunities for all of us." "Leave Utica?" The thought had never occurred to her. This town, despite its complicated past, was home. James nodded. "We don't have to decide right away, and if you'd rather stay, I'll turn it down." But I wanted you to know the option exists. Grace was quiet, considering. What about Pa? He'd come with us, of course. There's a new veterans home in Helena where he could work if he wanted to. Or simply enjoy his retirement, surrounded by his grandchildren. The idea took root in Grace's imagination, a new chapter, a fresh start, yet with all the people she loved still by her side. I'll think about it, she promised. We can talk to Pa tomorrow, see how he feels. James kissed her again, lingering this time. No rush. Whatever we decide, we'll decide together. That's how it's always been with us, and how it always will be. As they sat together under the star-filled sky, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of choice. From a father's desperate defense of his daughter's honor to a love that had transformed not just two lives but an entire community's perception. Their story had been one of redemption, of second chances, of courage rewarded. Whatever the future held, whether in Utica or Helena or somewhere yet unknown, Grace knew that the foundation built on that long-ago day when Thomas Lawson stood up for his daughter would support them all the days of their lives. For it was that single act of paternal love that had set in motion everything that followed, proving that sometimes the greatest gifts come from our darkest moments. And as James's arm tightened around her shoulders, as the porch swing swayed gently in the autumn breeze, Grace sent a silent prayer of gratitude into the night for her father's unwavering love, for her husband's steadfast heart, and for the beautiful life that had blossomed from the soil of sacrifice and courage. In defending her honor, her father had given her the greatest gift of all, the chance to find a love worthy of the heart she had honored him with. And in that perfect circle of giving and receiving, Grace had found not just happiness, but home.